He didn't flinch, not when the insult hit, not when the gun rose, not even when silence begged him to speak, not when the hostess looked up and paused, not when her eyes narrowed like she might have recognized him, or maybe just thought she did. That happened sometimes. People thought they remembered him, and maybe they did, or maybe they were thinking of someone else. The door had already swung shut behind him with a soft thud. No music yet, just ambient noise silverware on china, low murmurs, a glass tapping wood. He stood there for a moment, adjusting nothing. The bomber jacket he wore was creased at the elbows and a little too warm for the weather. He didn't seem to notice. His scarf was tucked in like habit, not fashion. And below the collar, just barely visible when he moved, a tiny silver pilot wings pin glinted, dulled by time. "Table for one, or sir?" the hostess asked, polite but hesitant. He nodded. "Back corner, if it's open." She glanced down at her chart, then motioned. "Follow me." He did, quietly, boots soft on tile, almost soundless, not sneaking, just deliberate, the way someone moves when every joint keeps a record of the years. They reached the table, by the window, but not front-facing. It looked out into a street that was always too busy for its own good. He sat down like gravity wasn't just a force, but a negotiation. Not heavy, exactly just aged. That particular kind of stillness only a man with loss could carry. "Water to start." He didn't answer right away. Then just the red, whatever's dry. The hostess nodded and disappeared. He didn't open the menu, didn't even glance at it. Instead, his hand slipped inside the jacket and pulled out a folded blue cloth. He laid it on the table like it meant something. And it did. For a while, he didn't move. His fingers rested gently on the cloth. His other hand hovered near the edge of the table, tapping it once, softly, like testing how real it all still was. In the reflection on the window, his face was there, cut by light, edged with lines. The jaw had a small unevenness, like a healed injury from long ago, a shadow of youth that never quite left, just hid behind fatigue. He exhaled, not a sigh, not exactly, more like a release of static, something that had been buzzing inside too long. Somewhere behind him, a laugh echoed too brightly, too young, too loud for the room. He didn't turn, just blinked, and for a second, just a flicker, there was a shape across from him. A boy, maybe 10, elbows on the table, chin resting in his palm, gone before he could look again. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, not because it hurt, just because, and then the jazz started. A piano, faint and melodic, something old, maybe Chet Baker, or maybe someone trying to sound like him. Didn't matter. He wasn't here for the music. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. There was something about glass, how it holds both the world and your face in the same frame. Harrison glanced toward the window again, not at the traffic, but the reflection. Light danced across it from somewhere behind, flickering past a pair of passing buses and the spinning sign of a coffee shop across the street. For just a second, he saw the shape again. The boy, same age, same posture, chin tucked into palm, like the weight of the world rested in his elbow. This time, Harrison didn't blink. He let the image settle, but it faded anyway. Glass wasn't built to hold ghosts. He shifted slightly in his seat, one shoulder rolling back like something tight had just pulled loose. His fingers brushed the folded cloth again, but not with purpose, just habit. A piano chord wandered somewhere from the far end of the room, hesitant, like the player wasn't sure anyone was listening. Outside, a delivery truck honked at a jaywalker. A siren passed 2 streets down. The world moved. It always did. He looked around for the waitress but didn't see her. Just couples talking, a man reading something on his phone, nodding like it mattered, a woman in a gray coat tearing her bread into perfect halves, over and over, like she didn't want to eat, just break. Then Harrison noticed the kid, not the one from the reflection. This one was real. Table against the wall, 2 booths over. Young 11, maybe skinny frame, press shirt too big for him. His back was straight, but not in the way adults sit, in the way kids do when they're trying to stay invisible. He wasn't eating, just holding a phone in both hands, elbows up like a tripod. The camera lens pointed forward at Harrison. Well, not just at him. The whole room, probably, but the boy's eyes were locked, curious, not scared, just interested. Harrison didn't move, didn't change posture or glance away. He let the moment exist. Behind the counter, a man in a black apron, must have been the boy's father, pretended to clean glasses. His hands weren't steady. Every few seconds, he'd glance toward the boy, then toward the kitchen, like waiting for someone or something to go wrong. It was subtle, but you could feel it, like a building with a hairline crack. Nothing's broken yet, but everything's listening. The air in the room was getting tighter, even if no one said a thing. Then the door slammed. Not closed, slammed, hard enough that silverware clinked. One woman startled and spilled a few drops of wine on her sleeve. The jazz faltered. No one stood up, but every head turned. Not Harrison. He just paused, one hand still resting on the cloth, the other now flat on the table. He didn't need to turn. He'd felt that kind of energy before. The kind that walks in like it owns every shadow in the room. The footsteps weren't loud, just too intentional. The kind that doesn't ask permission from the floor. They had that steady rhythm, the kind ex-athletes and certain cops carried, like the world should part for them. Harrison didn't look up. Not yet. He could feel the change in the air, how the table 2 over had gone silent, how the jazz didn't quite recover after the door slammed. Even the clink of glass at the bar sounded apologetic now. A presence reached his table before the man did. Then came the voice, flat, measured, devoid of warmth. "That's my seat." Harrison blinked once. Not slow, not fast. Just a quiet acknowledgement that words had landed. He looked down at the chair beneath him. No brass plate, no name etched in wood. Just a regular chair, standard cushion, slightly uneven leg, still held him fine. He glanced up, slowly. The man standing over him wore a patrol uniform. Fresh press, buzz cut, square jaw. Not the kind that happened naturally, more like it was forced into shape over years of trying too hard. Sunglasses still on, indoors. That always told you something. Badge gleamed on his chest like a threat, not a symbol. Harrison took a moment, tilted his head, let the sunlight shift across the pilot wings on his chest. Not flaunting them, just not hiding either. "No plaque on it," he said, voice level. The officer didn't move, just leaned forward slightly, shadowing the table. His belt nudged the edge of the linen. "I sit here every Tuesday," he replied. "This is my table. I got here first." Harrison raised an eyebrow, subtle, like a shrug that got lost on the way up. "Seems like a system that works," he said, and reached for the water glass that hadn't even been touched yet, swirled it once, didn't drink. The man exhaled through his nose, one of those nostril flares meant to suggest superiority, or frustration, or both. "You're in my seat," he repeated, firmer now. This time Harrison met his eyes, though, with the shades on. All he really saw was his own reflection. He tilted his head again, just slightly. "You planning to arrest me for it?" A pause, not long, just enough to draw a line in the sand. "Depends," the man said, mouth tight. "You planning to resist?" The word hung there, like a match waiting for oxygen. Harrison didn't flinch. He didn't even exhale. Instead, his eyes drifted to the blue cloth beside his hand. The edge had come loose. A thread curled out like a vein reaching for something. Will used to do that, tug threads on his sleeves when nervous. Ruined perfectly good shirts that way. Drove his mother nuts. He thought it made them look like lived-in stories. Harrison pulled the thread between his fingers. just for a second, then looked up. "I already ordered," he said. "Steak, dry red. I'll move when I'm done. No defiance, no challenge, just gravity." And for the first time, the man standing over him blinked. The silence between them wasn't mutual. One man stood waiting to be obeyed. The other wasn't standing at all. The officer shifted, just half a step. His boots scuffed the tile. Intentional. Maybe hard to say, but the sound echoed louder than it should have. Or maybe that was just how quiet the restaurant had become. Somewhere in the back, a knife slipped and hit a prep board harder than intended. No one turned to look. The officer leaned closer again, not bending to speak, just pushing air. His presence loomed, uninvited, like a storm testing the walls. "You don't look like someone who belongs here," he said, almost too casually. That one wasn't about the seat. Harrison's fingers stilled on the cloth. His other hand eased into his lap, resting there, idle. He didn't answer right away, because belonging, that was a word that had changed over the years. He used to fit in places, airfields, briefing rooms, cockpits. He'd spent a decade teaching kids how to fly drones, some for fun, others for careers they'd never finish. Will was one of them, obsessed with flying, though he never really cared for altitude. He just liked the idea of seeing things from above. Made him feel less small, he once said. Harrison had taken him to a simulator once, just the two of them. The lights dimmed low, screen wrapped around them like sky. Will laughed when he banked too hard on a virtual cloud and clipped a tree that wasn't really there. "You want to learn how to fly?" Harrison had asked. "No." Will had grinned, already pointing the in-game camera out the window. "I just want to film what flying looks like." He was holding a tiny camera that day. Cheap, plastic edges worn down from use. 2 weeks later, that same camera was misidentified as a weapon. On a sidewalk, in daylight. They said he matched a vague description. They said he ran. They said they had no choice. The memory didn't play like a video. It didn't even play. It just hovered unfinished. Back in the restaurant, Harrison finally spoke. "Still here, though." The officer frowned. "What you said, I don't look like I belong. Maybe I don't." He tapped the table once. "Still here." A breath passed between them. "Then Ryan Blake," the officer said, tilting his head slightly. "Downtown precinct. Know what that means?" Harrison didn't blink. "Means you're not on duty if you're harassing people over steak," he said. Flat. A laugh escaped from someone nearby. Short, sharp, immediately silenced. Ryan Blake didn't laugh. He leaned back a fraction, arms stiff, face tightening into something less human, more performative. And that's when Harrison noticed it. The boy, still recording, still locked in, elbows braced, frame steady, a human tripod in a room full of people pretending not to notice. Blake hadn't moved in a minute. Not really. He was standing there, but something inside him had gone rigid, like a man who suddenly realized he'd walked too far out onto ice. The boy hadn't moved either, his phone still tilted forward, lens peeking between a salt shaker and a folded napkin. His elbows didn't tremble, his face didn't change. It reminded Harrison of Will again. Not in any specific way, just the stillness. That kind of quiet hunger kids had when they sensed something real was happening, but couldn't name it. Will used to do that too. Watch without blinking, like the world might dissolve if he looked away too soon. And somewhere in Harrison's chest, something stirred. Not anger, not fear. Something colder, more precise. He reached slowly, not fast enough to draw attention toward his coat pocket. His phone was still there, tucked away next to an old receipt and a folded photo he hadn't looked at in weeks. His thumb found the screen, tapped once, no unlock needed, just one press. The screen flashed soft blue, barely noticeable, just a quiet ping. Code silent, sent. He left the phone face down beside the cloth. No rush, No announcement. Somewhere far from this restaurant, maybe 10 blocks east. Maybe more. An alert blinked red in a quiet LAPD terminal. Another buzzed inside the vest of Chief Samuel Harper. But none of that showed here. Inside Lancaster Bistro, nothing had changed. Not yet. Blake shifted his weight again, like trying to reassert territory he hadn't quite claimed. "You're making a scene," he muttered, a touch louder this time. Harrison's mouth twitched. Not a smile, just a reaction, like someone reacting to an insult they've heard too many times to care anymore. He looked at the boy again just briefly, and then back to the man towering over him. "Not yet," he said evenly. The words didn't rise. They settled, right between the silverware and the silence. Blake's nostrils flared. His hand hovered just a little too close to his belt now. Not on the holster, but near enough. And that's when Harrison felt the shift in the room. Not noise, not panic. Just the collective breath of people trying not to breathe. Forks frozen halfway to mouths. Glasses held midair. A man at the bar had stopped wiping down a tumbler. His hands frozen, cloth halfway across the rim. The pianist had stopped. No cue, just instinct. It wasn't a song anymore. It was the quiet before a fault line gives way. Harrison looked down at the cloth. One corner had begun to unravel. He traced the thread lightly with his nail. Will would have pulled it loose by now. He always did that when he didn't know what to say. Let the threads unravel instead of himself. The cloth trembled slightly when Harrison exhaled. Or maybe it was just his hand. Then he looked back up and finally asked, "You sure you want that kid to remember you like this for a second?" "Just one." Ryan Blake didn't say anything. That might have been the most dangerous moment of all. He just stared, through the shades, through himself maybe. Harrison couldn't see the officer's eyes, but he could feel them pressed against him like a wall trying to push through bone. The room wasn't breathing anymore. The piano had gone silent, and now even the hum of conversation had collapsed. It was the kind of quiet where thoughts got louder. And then Blake moved. Not a big movement, just one hand right side sliding down the curve of his vest, past the belt, toward the holster. Harrison's eyes didn't widen. His shoulders didn't tense. Only his thumb shifted just slightly, pressing his phone closer to the table's edge. Blake's fingers hooked the grip of his weapon, and in the time it took for a wine glass to tremble once on its stem, the gun was out, drawn, lifted, held, pointed chest level, 2 feet away, muzzle steady, arm not. Someone gasped near the kitchen, a high, short sound, like something tearing inside a throat. A fork clattered to the floor. No one reached down to get it. Across the restaurant, chairs scraped the tile like whispers. Half the diners ducked. The rest stayed frozen, caught somewhere between disbelief and paralysis. Harrison didn't move. He didn't even lean back. The pilot wings on his chest caught the light again. Dim, steady. Blake's voice, when it came, was rough. "Get up." No anger. Just desperation pretending to be command. Harrison glanced at the wine glass. The surface rippled, not from a breeze, from the weight of something shifting in the world. He looked up. "You sure about this?" he asked. Calm, not condescending. Almost tired. Blake didn't answer, just tightened his jaw. The gun trembled barely. A shimmer, but enough. "You think this makes you brave?" Blake hissed. Sitting there, waiting for someone else to step in, Harrison didn't blink. "You already made it too late for someone else," he said. The words landed like a dropped match in a dry field. No fire yet. But it was coming. Blake flinched just slightly. His hand didn't drop, but the focus in his face cracked. A thin fissure. Hard to see, impossible to ignore. Across the room, the boy still recorded. No movement, no noise, just quiet witness. Behind the bar, his father whispered into a phone, mouth barely moving. And Harrison, still seated, still not raising his voice, let the weight of the moment balance between his hand and the table. "I'm not trying to prove anything," he said softly. "But you are. And that's what makes this dangerous." The words didn't echo. They settled. Low. Final. The barrel of the gun didn't drop. But it wasn't rising anymore, either. And somewhere far away. But coming closer, sirens. The room had become a single breath held too long. The muzzle of Blake's gun hovered inches from Harrison's chest. But it wasn't the weapon people were watching anymore. It was the stillness behind it. The silence between two men, one seated, one shaking, and then, without warning, the ceiling spoke. Officer Ryan Blake. A voice. Firm. Low. Not shouting but loud in all the ways that mattered. "You are being watched. You are being recorded. You are no longer in control." Blake jolted like someone had poured cold water down his spine. His eyes darted upward, though no one could see them beneath the glasses. His hand twitched. Not enough to lower the weapon, but enough to admit he'd heard it. Every head in the room turned, slowly, searching. The speakers in the ceiling, usually reserved for jazz and birthday announcements, had become something else. A system of judgment, authority from the unseen. Behind the espresso bar, the boy's father froze mid-whisper, his phone still pressed against his cheek. His eyes locked on the officer, then flicked to Harrison, then back again. And Harrison. He didn't move, didn't smirk, didn't gloat, just stayed seated, one hand resting on the table, the other still near the phone, now dark. Blake stepped back half a foot, gun still raised. His voice cracked when he tried to find control again. "What the hell is this?" No one answered, until the ceiling did. "You have escalated a situation without cause. You are in violation of protocol. Stand down." The voice was unmistakable now. Chief Samuel Harper. It didn't matter whether the diners knew the name. Blake did. And so did Harrison. A slow exhale left Blake's lips. The kind people take when they realize their armor isn't bulletproof anymore. "I don't take orders from recordings," he muttered, but the fight in his voice was fraying. Harrison's gaze didn't waver. "You don't take orders from anyone, right?" Not taunting, just a question. A mirror. The kind of mirror Blake had spent his career avoiding. The boy was still recording. His phone never wavered. Somewhere, it had started broadcasting live. You could feel it. That sixth sense of digital judgment, 1,000 unseen eyes blinking in real time. Blake's hand trembled again. The gun wavered just slightly, enough for someone near the window to duck behind a chair. And then Harper's voice came again. Quieter, deadly precise. "Ryan, no title this time. You're suspended." Silence, then effective now. The weight of those words didn't fall. It sank like iron into water. Blake's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The gun in his hand wasn't a weapon anymore. It was just weight, heavy, and slipping. Blake didn't lower the gun. Not yet. But something had broken. Not the kind of break you could hear knock glass. Not bones. It was quieter than that. Internal. Structural. He looked down the barrel as if suddenly realizing it wasn't a shield anymore. Just steel. Just a shape he wasn't sure how to hold without purpose. Across from him, Harrison Ford didn't blink. He sat like he'd been carved into the chair. Still, centered, his eyes steady. The wings pinned to his chest caught a flicker of reflected light. A glass somewhere cracked in the back. Not loudly, just enough to sound like a warning. The boy's phone never moved. Blake's arm began to tremble in a new way now. Fatigue, maybe, or the kind of tremble you get when the adrenaline runs out and leaves shame behind. Then, slowly, almost carefully, Blake lowered the gun. The muzzle dipped. Not all the way, but enough. People didn't clap. No one cheered. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was quieter, like the room had been holding its breath for so long. It forgot how to exhale. And then Blake reached for his badge. Not urgently, not defiantly. just like a man following the only instruction left that didn't require pride. He unclipped it from his uniform, looked at it for a second longer than necessary, and didn't hand it to Chief Harper. Didn't set it on the floor. Instead, he dropped it, right onto Harrison's table. Clack. The sound wasn't loud, but it was final. The badge spun once, then stopped. Right beside the folded blue cloth, one man's authority, another man's memory, side by side. Harrison didn't touch it. He didn't look at Blake. Not yet. The officer's voice came low, hoarse, almost aimless. You think this means something to you? Harrison's hand drifted, but not toward the badge. He touched the corner of the cloth instead, straightened it gently, then looked up. It means something to you, he said. That's why it landed like that. Blake swallowed. His eyes behind the glasses were unreadable now. The chief hadn't moved. He stood just inside the entrance, arms folded, waiting not as a threat, but like a judge giving space for someone to finish sentencing themselves. Blake looked at Harrison one last time, and for the first time, his face held no aggression, just exposure. The kind of nakedness that comes after too much pretending. He turned slow, stiff, and walked toward the exit, the chief at his side. The badge remained, untouched, unclaimed. The restaurant was still. Not silent exactly, sounds had returned in slow trickles. The clink of glass, a cough near the back. The piano hadn't started again, but the keys waited. No one moved toward the table. Not the staff, not the manager, who had finally peeked out from behind the bar but quickly stepped back. The badge lay between a folded handkerchief and a phone whose screen had long since gone dark. Harrison sat in the same position, shoulders relaxed, but spine straight. His fingers rested on the table's edge like he was holding something invisible. Across the room, the boy with the phone slowly lowered it. He didn't stop recording. He just let his arms fall to his sides. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he stood, not rushed, not theatrical, just like he knew something had changed, and the right thing to do was to move toward it. His father reached out with one hand, gentle, wordless, but didn't stop him. The boy walked carefully through the room, around the tables, past the frozen stares and shallow breaths, until he stood beside the empty chair across from Harrison. He didn't ask at first, just looked down at it. Then, can I sit? Harrison looked up. His face didn't change, but something shifted behind the eyes. The kind of movement that doesn't register unless you're watching for it. He nodded once. The boy climbed onto the seat. Small, his feet didn't touch the floor. He sat with both palms on his knees like he was trying to sit still the way adults did. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then the boy glanced at the badge, at the cloth, at the phone, at Harrison's face. My dad said you used to be in movies. A breath, almost a smile. Still am, sometimes. Harrison replied. The boy squinted. Was this part of when Harrison looked at him fully for the first time? No, he said. Not this. The boy nodded like that made perfect sense. Like he'd already known the answer, but needed to hear it aloud. A pause. Then he leaned forward just slightly. I filmed the whole thing. Harrison's brow lifted, but his tone stayed level. You did? Huh. Yeah, I didn't know why at first. I just thought it mattered. The boy's voice didn't shake, but there was something in it earnest, exposed. Harrison didn't answer right away. He looked down at the table, at the cloth, at the badge, then back at the boy. It did. He said. The words landed gently, like a hand on a shoulder. Not heavy, just enough. The footage went viral by nightfall. Different angles, different phones. The moment the gun came out, the moment it lowered, the badge, spinning, the silence between two men, the stillness that held an entire room hostage without ever shouting. They called him the man who didn't move. Talk shows called it restraint. Comment sections called it staged. Comment sections always do. But the boys' video, the original one, had no edits, no zooms, no filters, just still hands and a steady frame. Somewhere in it, you could even hear him breathing. Harrison never watched the full video. He didn't need to. He already knew what happened. A week later, Lancaster Bistro reopened like nothing had cracked its walls. Fresh flowers in the vases, a new hostess, young, overly cheerful. The badge was gone. So was the cloth. The table had been cleaned, reset, like memory could be wiped with white linen and polish. He walked past it once, just once. Didn't go in, paused near the window, watched a man laugh too hard at his own story. A woman adjusting her earring in a spoon's reflection. A waiter carrying too many plates for too few tips. Life, moving forward, whether it had permission or not. He kept walking. 4 blocks south, a modest building with no sign waited for him. Community desk, folding chairs, fluorescent lights that hummed a little too loud. Inside, 7 people sat around a long table, a former principal, a young activist, a mother of 3, a retired sergeant, and others who didn't get camera time but got things done. They stood when he entered, not because he asked, just because some people still knew how to respect quiet when it walked into the room. He nodded at them, sat down without ceremony, no speeches, no banners. They got to work, and Harrison. He listened more than he spoke. He asked careful questions. Occasionally, he corrected someone gently, never harsh. Later, at home, he opened the top drawer of his desk, pulled out the folded cloth, the edge still frayed, still loose like a story with one thread left hanging. He unfolded it once, then again. Beneath it, wrapped in the same cloth since the day they handed it back to him, was the silver pilot wings, Will's, the ones they'd found still pinned to his collar. Right above where the blood had stopped spreading, Harrison held them in his hand, not tight, not reverent, just present. Outside, a breeze moved through the open window. Light caught in the wings for a second. He looked at the photo on the shelf. Will, grinning, camera in hand. That same grin from the simulator. The same kid who once said, "I don't want to fly. I just want to show people what flying looks like." Harrison breathed, then whispered, "You would have liked how it ended." No one else heard, but maybe that was the point. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.